there's been a lot of talk about how this river meandered all the time, and I spoke to that a bit. And if you look at how narrow this valley is now, quickly the elevation rises to either side of the river. It's pretty evident this river's not going to meander much. Certainly not like the Grand Round or the Powder River and the Baker and the Grand Round valleys did, where you get the large, big turns in the river. That in itself makes the water act entirely differently here, or the use of it entirely different. You can depend on that river meandering a little bit, but it sucks right back to the lowest place in the valley pretty fast because it's so fast flowing, it gets right back to the lowest part of the valley. It can't flow south or north very far until it's right back in the channel. And most of the meandering we saw was, like I said, several 100,000 years ago. That's a lot of generations of people. We have about 5 generations for every 100 years. You start talking about 500,000 years of an ice age, or 6.3 million years of the Cenozoic era, or 2.6 million years of the Pleistocene era. You know that there wasn't much meandering going on. Some places, the ditches, this meandering has stayed. Channel. I mentioned it in 1872, about a third of the river ran through what we now call the old river channel. And the early pioneers went to the head of that old river channel where it came out of the river, and they cut a cottonwood tree and they anchored it to another cottonwood tree, and they shoved it off in the river, or they pulled it off in the river with a team of horses, and they headed that water off. So more water went down the main channel of the river, and they weren't being flooded every spring, and they gained a little bit of farmland. And that operation basically continued until the 1950s and 60s. You'd go up in the late summer, and you'd pull that cottonwood tree out in the river, and you'd get a cat in the river, a D7 or D8 from a logger, and you'd push the gravel up and make a wing in the river, and everybody up the valley did basically the same thing to get water out of the river when they were in their diversion points when it was low in the fall. Then we began to run into a problem with the fish. When you got into the river at that time of the year, you created a lot of sediment turmoil and roiled the river up, and that mud went down the river and covered the spawning beds of the fish. And so the fish people logically didn't want you in the river at certain times during the year. And so you had to adapt your irrigation practices, and it became harder to talk a logger into sinking his cat below the main transmission in that river and having a danger of getting water in his machinery and all that. So they didn't want to do it either. So we had to do a series of diversions in the river down there to get our water out. And what caused that was this. The state or the federal government came out with a plan, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the things the federal government did that we look back on and say, well, that was a stupid thing to do. But at the time, it seemed a logical thing to do, I guess. And one of them was straightening the rivers. So they had a plan where they would aid the rancher in straightening the river. And they had a cost share program. And they went to the head of the valley, and they went almost to the city dump in Wallowa, if you know where that is, or just below the new bridge in Wallowa. And they had a program where they paid part of the price to put dikes and gabions along the banks of the river to control that river and to keep it in a channel and straighten the channel. Well, that gained more land for the farmer and kept his land from being flooded and eroded in the spring. So it seemed like a pretty good program, didn't it? It seemed like a Pretty good program to you, thinking about it? Yeah, okay, we did that all across the West, and not just Wallowa Valley or not just Lower Valley. In 1982, my Uncle Reed Johnson, now deceased, and I began to look at a diversion point on the Wallowa River, and we said to ourselves, you know, this river's dropping quite a little bit. We're not going to be able to get water out of our diversion point. What are we going to do? This is looking at disaster right down the throat. So we went to the SCS office and we asked their engineers to give us a plan, draw a plan for a dam across the river down there, some kind of a permanent diversion point. We can solve the fish problem and we can solve the diversion problem for our water. Now, and the fish people, as I said, didn't want us in the river, but we owned that, the landowner owns that water and he has a right to take the water out of the river. That's not contested. But we didn't want to do anything to ruin the fish situation. And so we began to look at that river again. And it was about 4 feet to 6 feet lower than where they put the dikes and the gabions on the banks in 1970, I should say, when they did that river project. In other words, the river being channelized had dropped that much. The high water wasn't even reaching the rocks that we put in there to protect the river banks in the 70s. It's amazing how much that river changed. Now, why did it change? For 2 reasons. In the lower valley, it changed for 2 reasons. In 1980, we had tremendous high water, and it flooded that last house and buildings right at the head of the canyon that Mrs. Rawls lives in now. She's a postmistress in Enterprise. They have that land now. Leonard Knight lived there at that place at that time, and the water got right up to the level of his front porch. And so when the water went down, he was in the logging business, and his son-in-law was in the gravel business, and they went down to the head of the canyon, and they said, this is not going to happen to us again. And they took their 966 and their D7s, and they dug about 6 feet of gravel out of that river and put it up on a bank where they could feed their cows from right at the head of the canyon, about 3/4 of a mile up there, and lowered that river. Then they ran into a basalt flow, one of these Cenozoic basalt flows that we had here, and nothing can touch that rock. It's just too hard to run a cat through or do anything unless you dynamite it out. So right about where my land is on the western border of the Wallowa River, we stopped that project stopped. But that disturbed the bottom of the river, and when you disturb the bottom of these rivers, the gravel starts to move. And if you stand, you don't realize how much power that river has until you stand on the bank and listen to it and watch it. But where our diversion point is on the river down there, it's all the water basically that's coming out of the whole Wallowa Valley comes through there. The river's 110 feet wide there, and it runs a lot of water. And you can stand there at our diversion point and watch rocks that big just going down that river like you're throwing them. I mean, and gravel is just doing this. If you're not familiar with working around a river, that's a really amazing thing, that it's moving rocks that big, that far down from the high mountains. Well, that caused a drop in the gravel. Then the state in 1982 rebuilt the road from Minham to where we live, where Lower Diamond Road hits the highway. You know, from the gun club, from the sawmill in Wallowa, the Lower Diamond Road hits the highway. We live right across the highway there. they decided to rebuild the road and strengthen the shoulders of the highway for heavier loads from Minham to that point. And there was a place over there, 20 acres, called Weaver's Pond. We refer to it as Weaver's Pond. It's a game commission uses it for trout pond and things. And it's owned by the state, but they gave it to the game commission to use for a game area and fish pond. They gave the contract to Morris Brothers and Corvallis, to a big gravel and paving company, to rebuild that road. And they said, when you bid the job, the gravel can come out of Weaver Pond. There's plenty of gravel on that 20 acres. You just dig the pond and dig as much pond as you wanted. So the pond being fairly shallow, they dug it down about 15 feet deep all over that, a goodly amount of that 20 acres. But they got the project about 3/4 completed, and their engineers said, "Hope, there's not enough gravel here. What are we going to do? We bid this job on you're telling us there's not enough gravel." Well, the state being the state and having the power they have, they just said, we'll just go over above the bridge. It borders a river right above the Weaver Bridge for that 1/4 mile, and take all the gravel you need right out of the river. They didn't get a permit. They didn't need a permit. They didn't cause you, like a private person, to go through the state lands and the water board and get a permit to take gravel out of the river. They just took it out. And they went up the river till they got enough gravel to finish their highway project. And when they finished the river, it was about 6 feet lower than where they started. So they lowered the river about 6 feet. And when you have a 6 feet bank of gravel facing you, what happens to it when the river runs over it? It erodes it off, and it erodes it off right up the river. And that's what caused the river to drop precipitously up to where we were trying to take water out. So we were faced with a problem with the river that had dropped at least 6 feet in a mile and a half, and dropped clear down below the old dikes that I said that the government put in to stop erosion. So Reed and I, as I said, contacted the engineer we had a little trouble. The engineers changed and they couldn't get the plans drawn, and they didn't get the plans drawn, so we decided to draw them ourselves. So we sat in Burroughs Cafe with a napkin, and we designed a dam that we thought would work across that river. And we went to Terry Jones, who had South Fork Ready Mix at that time, and said, we've got to do something at this riverside or we're not going to have any water. And here's what we think we want to do. Here's our plan for a dam across this river. It's 110 feet wide. We dug down 8 feet, and it's 2 walls going across that dam, and cement at the bottom of that, and 2 aprons, one apron about 20 feet below the dam and one about 2 feet above the dam, river level. And then stops across there, every 8 feet of stops across that dam, across that river. And he made a few suggestions on wings on the river, and so we went to the Fish Commission, and we told them that we would build this dam and we'd stay out of the river. And they were all for that, so they wrote a letter to the State Division of Lands, and we got their okay, and we got our ditch users at a meeting to suck it up and pull their billfolds out and come up with about $50 an acre of cost to build that dam. We only had 720 acres under the ditch, that particular diversion point. And I said, well, here's when we're going to start. We're going to start in late September building this dam. And I ran into a fish commission, said, well, you can't do that. The only time you can get in that river is from June the 10th to July the 5th. And I said, we can't build a dam to the highest water in that river. We can't hold a dam. And they said, you're going to have to build a cofferdam on one side and build half the dam and then move your cofferdam and then build the other half of the dam. And I said, that water's 4 feet deep there flowing down that river at that time of the year. That's not practical for us. We can't do that. Well, they said, okay, but you're going to have to build the cofferdams in September. And I said, we're not going to build the cofferdams. I just stiffened my back and I said, we're not building the cofferdams. We're going to build a trench around that site. We're going to dam the river off above the trench. We're going to change the flow of the Wallowa River in September around our site. 2 weeks we'll be in there, build that dam and be out of there and put the dikes back out of the river and fill the trench back up. And we did. And then we got it done. It cost us $44,000. In early 1990s, we formed the Wallowa Valley, the Lower Valley Water Irrigation District, and got BOR funding to build a second dam across the river above the new bridge down there. It's up there. We just had rocks in the river there, and that was not a good situation for fish passage and everything. And so again, the Fish Commission was in favor, and the BOR had Bonneville Power money at that time that came through Grand Man Model Watershed and other sources. And we built a similar structure up there. It's a little bit different design and probably a better design than my Uncle Reed and I had. But it cost us $280,000. And both of them are still operating. Sometimes you just have to grab the horse by the collar and do it. That's all I can say. Now, as I've watched the irrigation practices down there, we pretty much irrigate. It's all pretty much flood irrigated, except a little bit of sprinklers there on the Doherty place and on Harshfields. That's going north along the Promise Road. Everything else is flood irrigated. I would love to sprinkler irrigate, but my land is not adaptable to sprinkler irrigation, even though I can see the value of it. The fields are cut up by 4 streams. The highway cuts through my land. Nothing's square. You can't swing a pivot. You can't run a hand line without being out there and adding pipes and changing pipes and moving pipes around. So it's not very adaptive to any kind of sprinkler irrigation system. Now, most of the other thing is the Middle Valley sprinkler systems that have put in, the sprinklers were purchased primarily by the government, and they were able to sell their extra water that they're not using to the Lostine River, because the Lostine River needed extra water for fish passage at different times of the year. So they had a market for the water that they saved by sprinkler irrigating versus flood irrigating. I don't have that market. Nobody's buying water for the Wallowa River because it has, as low as I've ever seen it is about like that in the last 50 years or even 80 years. So there's plenty of water for fish passage in the head of the canyon. They're not worried about fish getting up there. They do worry about in the Lostine River, and so there was money available to sell their water rights. So they irrigate May, June, and July, and they just cut them off. They're just cut off. They've given up their August and September water rights because it just doesn't pay them. They're not running. Woody Wolf is not running cattle on his ground, so he's not trying to raise full pasture like we are, so he's in a little different situation. But the advantages of sprinkler irrigation are tremendous. You're on the satellites, you pipe your water, you save your ditch leakage, you put instrumentation in the ground that measures your water when you get down to the root level, and you stop when you get to the bottom of the root level of your crop. You turn your water off, and when it dries out, you irrigate again. You become much more efficient. You can do it with your cell phone from your shop when you're doing something else. You don't have to go out there and carry a shovel around and an irrigation dam and things like that. So it's a real time saver. It's a wonderful way to irrigate, much more efficient, but it doesn't fit every place that you think it's going to fit. And so when somebody says to us down there, why don't you put sprinklers in? Well, you just put sprinklers in and figure out how much time it takes, and you're out of the sprinkler business pretty fast.
Dale, so the development of the pivot systems up here has been rapid in the last 5 years. And the super efficient irrigation that you're talking about. Number one, what impact does that have on the lower valley? And number two, what impact is that going to have on groundwater tables?
Well, I'd make these comments about that, and I alluded to it in the paper. If you put 5.5 acre feet of water on a piece of ground, it goes somewhere, right? I mean, it doesn't all evaporate. It goes in the soil and goes someplace. If you go to an irrigation system and a pipeline system and you only put 35 inches of water on your ground, that extra water is lost to the wetlands and to the reflow into the river and everything somewhere down the valley. When you flood irrigate, that water comes back into the river and it's used again and goes out and is irrigated and used again, goes out, probably used 4 times down through this valley. If it's not flowing through the ground, you basically lose it. And that's why I said some of this marshy ground is drying up. Some of your ditch banks are drying up. It's changing a little bit of the environment. And you can notice it in several places. I notice it in the willow trees and the cottonwoods. They're stressing. They don't have the water where they've piped all their water, and they don't have any loss of water through stream bank lossage. It changes how much the springs dry up. The ground takes more water to get back up to full of water in the spring than it did before because the water table's dropped. And I've noticed that, we measured our water when we put our head gates in, and we measured the water that went out of the 2 ditches in Rock Creek and flowed back into the river. And many, many days of the year, we had more water flowing out of our ground back into the river, and we were taking out of the river at our diversion points and irrigating with. Where was that water coming from? Ditch leakage mostly. That ditch goes around behind the old mill site and around toward Promise and irrigates, the Lower Valley ditch irrigates Lower Valley. And it probably loses, by the time it gets to the end of that ditch, probably 40% of the water. And that water kept Lower Valley water table up to about 3.5 or 4 feet. That's our water table. You can take a backhoe and dig a post hole down 4.5 feet to dig a fence, and it's just mud your neck, and you can sit there and drink a Coke, and it's clear. By the time you finish a Coke, that water is flowing through there, and it's clear. It's flowing through that gravel that fast. And that cleans out water, and that cools that water. And when it goes into the river, you have a better environment in the river. You have a cooler river water. you have a better environment for fish, and I think that the sprinkler systems are going to have an effect on that, because that water is not going to be there anymore. Well, what are they going to do with it? Well, the water in the Wallowa Lake is a whole different deal. That's stored water, and that's a different water right than in-stream water rights. So that the people that own the Wallowa Lake Dam own that water right in the lake, so they can file and get more water rights for later in the year from their stored water, and they can get, I think now under the adjudication they can get a foot, but you'd have to check with the water master on it. But they can get up to a foot more water in the fall. That's more than enough with the foot they have to raise another crop. Now the thing that happened in the early days was the pioneers came in here, and what did they have? They had sheep or cows. That's what they had. And they didn't send crops to Japan. They didn't send crops to Korea. They didn't send crops to Hermiston. They didn't send crops to the big dairies in the desert down there. They were lucky if they had a mowing machine that would mow 10 or 15 acres of hay a day. And they were interested, like my grandfather, interested in getting enough hay cut to feed their sheep and cows in the fall. So they weren't after a third crop alfalfa. They were happy with one crop of grass, and let the grass grow and harvest it with an old cow or with a sheep. That's all changed now. The farming practices have changed. We're haying earlier because of climate. I believe because the climate's changed, we're haying earlier. We've got crops that mature earlier, and so you want to start haying them for their protein value earlier. All of those things have changed since the 1880s, but the water rights that they filed were adequate for those folks in that day. They're not adequate now. The river is over adjudicated. There's no way to say, well, we need more water in August and September, which is obvious, but there's no water in the river. It's already called for. By the time you take all the water out that's already adjudicated, it's less water that's in the river now. We're operating on borrowed time now. And that's not going to change. And if these snowpacks don't increase, if they continue to decrease, we've got to be more efficient with our irrigation, but it's going to have an effect on what the land looks like. It's going to look more like it did in 1872 when my great-grandfather came in here. Anything away from just the riparian areas, the river was dry. It didn't have all this extra water that came out of the lake and was stored and was dammed up and flowed all year long. It just had what went into the lake at the head of the lake in August and what came out in August. That's what I've noticed, observed. Now, one thing, the government does a lot of different things. Some of them turn out good and some of them not so good. One of them that I really get upset about is canary grass. Now, all of you know what canary grass looks like? Well, drive around these ditches now, and it's that grass. It's about that high. It has a head bloom on it about like this. It's a pretty rich protein grass, but it's a very early grass, and it's not as palatable to cattle or sheep after it matures as other grasses. They brought that canary grass in to stop erosion in places like Swamp Creek and the streams from the north that flow into the valley to stop Dry Creek and Parsnip Creek, and it's just taken over the valley, and it's plugged all these streams up till you have a tough time getting water through them, and it raised the water table so it spreads out in your fields and you can't grow the valuable grasses. You're stuck with canary grass, and there's not very many ways you can get rid of it. You can't spray along those creeks. Another program that they had, they decided that fencing these creeks would stop erosion, and I said, I'm not in that ball game. You're not convincing me that that's a good idea. Well, we'll give you $50 an acre and help you build the fences. I don't care how much money you got. That's not good. And so a lot of farmers bought into that $50 and fenced their creeks. They're going to stop the trumping in of erosion along the creek banks. Now they're full of weeds and canary grass. You can't hardly walk through them. You can't fish them because you can't get your fish line in the streams, and streams like Prairie Creek and the streams that go through my ranch. After Memorial Day, you just forget the trout fishing or anything because you can't get the hook in the stream, and if you catch something, you can't get him through the grass to get him out of there. The other thing the government did that was a real mistake in this country, I thought, was they brought meadow foxtail into this valley and planted it. Now, meadow foxtail is a good grass. It has a lot of value. It's in its place. It's got plenty of protein. But the best place for meadow foxtail, where it came from, was like southern Harney County and Lake County, around those Silver Lake and Summer Lake and around Burns, where they needed an early maturing grass that was wet rooted, needed wet roots. So they brought it in and said, well, this grass will grow in our cold early springs. But it grew real fast, it matures real fast, it heads out before it's ever be able to hay, and it's not as good a grass for us as brome grass and orchard grass and timothy and an alfalfa mix, and it outcompetes those other grasses early in the year. And they planted it in the lower valley, and I'm trying to remember, I take a guess in the 60s, and it just moved through this valley. And you can farm ground down there and get an alfalfa crop back in and your good grasses back in. And about 4 or 5 years later, you're farming meadow foxtail again. That's another government project that looked like it was going to be a great deal. It didn't work very well.
I wonder if Jim could relate that this fish spawning to various cycles of the irrigation that you talked about. I mean, up till now, these, flood irrigation and then sprinkler irrigation and then precise sprinkler irrigation and the straightening of channels. I mean, is there a history of spawning that you could parallel Dale's comments to?
I would have to think about that one, and Brian jump in if you have some thoughts.
Give you time to think about it a little bit, and I'll make a comment or two. When that canary grass takes over a ditch, like the natural streams that flow through my place, River Channel, Groat Creek, and Dry Creek flow through my place all the time. That plant's roots will grow right in the water and gather soil and stop erosion. Well, what it did was gathered soil and held the soil back, and it covered the gravel bars in those streams. This is my observation. And I have a picture of the first fish I ever caught out of Dry Creek in 1940. And I have a picture catching about the same size of fish out of Dry Creek in 1982. From 1940 to 1982, the same spot. And the fishing isn't near as good as it was. And I think it's because of the mud in the bottom of the creeks have made it less desirable for the trout to come up in there out of the river and use that creek, or the salmon to use that creek. However, I'll say this. I was talking to my trapper the other day, and he said he noticed a lot of silver salmon in that dry creek last fall. And he hadn't noticed those for years. And neither have I. Of course, I'm going south in the winter now, but it's been a long time since silver salmon in any numbers have been up Dry Creek.
We reintroduced coho silver
Yeah,
salmon in
yeah.
2017, and they are recolonizing lots of areas here that they were essentially excavated in the early 1970s, late 1970s.
Yeah, I know you've been trying to do that, but seeing them up in that stream and get into gravel where they can spawn, they don't like that mud. They don't. I mean, I don't think they like the mud. They get up farther in Dry Creek and it get washed out. It gets washed out because there's not as much canary grass up toward where Dry Creek heads out on the Pawtka Ridge Road, where you go on the Pawtka Ridge Road. Up there, they can get up there in water and have some better spawning areas in my place.
Well, you're absolutely right. Salmon and steelhead need gravel,
Yeah,
mud,
Yeah.
on the bottom of the streams to successfully reproduce. I can mention this. So my perspective is much shorter in time than yours. But when I first came here in the 90s, the lower Lostine would go dry.
Mhm.
So one of the things that rings true to me that you said is a lot of these areas are over allocated in terms of water rights. And so you talk about spawning. I guess the question was spawning, distribution. Late arriving salmon could not access their spawning grounds that were further up because the water down lower was dry. They couldn't access those areas up higher. And now the water does flow all the way through in the Lostine, and those late arriving salmon can access spawning areas that they couldn't before.
well, the agreements that you came up with the Lostine water users to flush the river, so to speak, and buying some water, or groups buying water to put in that river, have helped solve the problems there. But those little streams, like when I was a kid, we would catch a lot of steelhead, and a lot of trout would come up there, and they'd be in those streams, and they're not there now. And the only thing I can figure out by observation is the mud on the bottom of the streams is not good habitat for them, and so they tend to stay down in the river. And of course, that's where the fishery is. But from a water use point of view, when you pipe this water and sprinkle, you're not using near as much water to grow your crops. The water stays in the river. It's not being used out on the. It's not flowing through that 80 foot of gravel and cleaning itself and cooling itself and going into that river at 15 degrees lower temperature all winter long. Then that river can run, and that helps the trout population. That keeps the river at a temperature that's conducive to fish. I can take you over on my place and put you on your knees and stick your hand down in the spring creeks to the elbow, and you're yelling uncle in 15 seconds. It's that cold. And it doesn't freeze in the wintertime. And the ducks use it, and the river otter use it, and bless the beaver, they're going to save our lives, or I guess somebody says they're going to save our lives. You got to remember that's a dream, I think. It hasn't been well thought out, but that's my own opinion.
Dale, we used up our time. People have to get back to work. It's
Well,
a little after 1. Thank you very very much, and I think people can hang out and ask specific questions if they want.
Sure. I'm retired. Thank you.
We'll get recorded, so we'll get the word back. Okay? Yes.
I hope it met your expectations.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Well, there are advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage